Welcome to Savage Minds. I'm your host, Julian Vigo. Today's guest is Vivek Chibber, who teaches sociology at New York University. He is the author of many books and articles, including The Class Matrix, Social Theory After the Cultural Turn, published by Harvard in 2022. He's also editor of Catalyst, a journal of theory and strategy, and the host of the podcast Confronting Capitalism. I welcome Vivek Chibber to Savage Minds. I'm really thrilled to have you on the show. I'd like to kick off with a topic that I know you've opined upon in the past, but I think it's sort of one of those red light moments, and I wonder if the left might address this subject. I've been alarmed by the way leftist discourse has been hijacked by identity politics. And while I understand how historically groups banded together to garner strength in numbers and to meet to discuss particular issues, I've also seen how the left has been completely abandoned. The traditional left has been about focusing on workers' rights, jobs, housing, wages, healthcare, education, childcare, in addition to fighting internationally, let's say, neocolonial political takeovers, the military-industrial complex, and so forth. But over the past 20 years, roughly, we have witnessed an alarming hijacking of leftist discourse in the modern left's focus on disparate identities, twinning the left with a type of neoliberal division and diversion as well. And I'm truly concerned that these groups' insertion or these discourses' insertion within the left has resulted in a prioritizing of symbolic representation within capitalism over a unified class struggle against it. There are so many problems, I'd say, that are far more troubling within this, because nothing to do with identitarianism has to do with class struggle whatsoever. Yet these discourses have been the Trojan horse for ushering forth one wave after another of neoliberal rhetoric, of commodified identitarianism, all the while holding the pseudo-markings of leftism, the language of class and racial equality at times, when in reality, the ethos of these groups is often the exact opposite. The focus on hyper-individualism, the siloing of identities that operate like pop-up markets with claims that this is the pathway to social liberation. As we have witnessed this shift from universalism to identitarianism, the left has led itself into a political dead end, in my opinion, alienating many traditional supporters. Is there a way to roll this back? And if so, how?
Yeah, I think what you've said captures it perfectly, Gillian. Let me make a couple of historical points, and then I'll address the final question that you raised about solutions. The way you said it when you set up the question is partially correct, but even I think that doesn't quite get at the nature of the problem. The way you framed it was you said that groups have gotten together to try to address their particular dilemmas, the facts of their domination, and to try to fight against it. Now that's true, but right in the modern era, when you start in the 19th century, when modern anti-colonial struggle started, through the 20th century, there weren't groups per se that were getting together. What there was elements within larger groups that got together. Now, if by group, we mean, let's say in a colonial country, members of the dominated nationality, they get together to try to fight against their colonial domination. But right from the start, always and everywhere, it was class stratified. And right from the start, how they perceived their liberation, the content of the liberation, and the program around which they fought for their liberation was entirely determined by the class constituency that was doing the organizing. And this is what the modern identitarian left has essentially erased. So the language is that Indians got together, or South Africans got together, or Egyptians got together, and that's simply not true. The way it started everywhere was Egyptian elites or Indian elites or South African elites got together. And they essentially were lobbying groups, not for national liberation, never for national independence. They always started with lobbying for what? Better and more widespread entree of dominated elites, rich Indians, rich Egyptians, into the colonial or neocolonial state. It was never, never, not once, as far as I know, in any instance, was there a drive for what we call national liberation or national independence that would serve the majority of that dominated population. So how did we get from narrow elite lobbying efforts for more social advancement to something like national liberation? It was when either sections of those elites found that they were getting nowhere and the colonial state was just ignoring them, because who's going to listen to 500 Indians saying, hey, we want more rights for ourselves? The British said, screw you. Why should we do anything for you? So either a section of them found that they had to start a mass struggle, or the masses inserted themselves forcibly onto the scene through trade union movements, through peasant movements, or large urban movements. It was only when they either turned their narrow struggles into mass struggles, or when the masses forcibly interjected themselves, that you got something like a national movement. And once that happened, the content of national liberation changed. Early on, when it was elite dominated, it was just for basically more entree of richer, dark-skinned people into the state and into business. That was a class demand to basically widen the colonial apparatus for more participation by elites. Now the content changed to something like actual needs of the masses of the people. And at that point, national independence movements became an internally stratified movement where with unceasing contestation between rich, darker-skinned people and poor, darker-skinned people as to who would dominate the movement, whose demands would dominate the movement. And that is the history of the anti-colonial world. Who won the internal struggle for setting the agenda? And in some places, it was workers and peasants who ended up dominating through communist parties, through socialist parties. Other places like India, like Egypt, they left essentially was relegated to a secondary position, and you got what was bourgeois movements for independence, but independence became a transfer of power from one set of elites to another set of elites. So the lesson here is this: there has never been such a thing as people banding together per se. It's always been strata within the national body that dominates, and it depends on which stratum dominates. Now, the history of identity politics in the US is identical. So it's never been the case that Black people came together or Latinos came together per se. It was Black people under the leadership of the Black bourgeois and Black elites, or Black people under the leadership and the influence of the Black left, which is what the civil rights movement, Martin Luther King and Bayard Rustin, A. Philip Randolph, were all socialists. And they envisioned civil rights to be rooted not just in political equalization, but also in jobs, justice, in social insurance, in real economic transformation. And on that, they lost. They lost that battle by 1969. And it was the Black middle class that came to dominate that battle from the 70s onward. Now, that has been the history of what we call identitarianism everywhere. Essentially, until the 1990s, we didn't have this term called identity politics. What we had was racial oppression and racial liberation, anti-oppression struggles and liberation struggles. And those were the reason you used that language was that that language came out of the socialist left. And the socialist left never said we have to prioritize class over race. They never said that. What they said was the road to racial liberation comes through foregrounding the interests of working class Black people, working class brown people. They didn't say wait for socialism and then we'll deal with your racial oppression. What they said was the road to racial liberation comes through organizing not the rich Blacks, not the rich Latinos, but the poor ones. And they are going to have to link up with white workers. Otherwise, they'll never win because they're a minority. You can't have a Black working class fighting out on its own when it's only 14% of the population. It's going to have to link up with the white working class. But that in doing so, it will not degrade or demote race matters. It will fight for them, but through these links. So then this brings us then to your question: how do we come out of this? Once we recognize that anti-racism has always had two faces, an elite face and a subaltern, a working class face, then we see that the left should not and has never called for demoting anti-racism. Every one of us should be prioritizing anti-racism. What the left has said, though, is that the elite version of anti-racism is not anti-racism at all. It's simply a class movement to advance the interests of the wealthier among these black and brown populations. And that means the solution is this. It's what it's always been. You fight for racial and gender liberation through organizing the poor. And B, you cannot win if you are a narrow sectional movement of even those poor people. Because in order to get what poor black people want, what Indians want in Britain, what women want, things like healthcare, childcare, things like guaranteed jobs, you're going to have to move the state. You're going to have to reprioritize what the state does in terms of its budgets, in terms of its priorities. And to do that, you need to have a broad mass movement, which means the anti-racism has to be part of a universal struggle for social justice. It can't be siloed off into, hey, until you prove your anti-racist credentials to us, we were going to calumniate you. Because understand, you're a tiny little minority. You can't stand on the sidelines and say, white people, prove yourselves to us. That is a recipe for failure. You're going to have to say to them, we are all part of a broad movement for justice. And what we're going to insist on is the anti-racism be part of that. And what you'll find when you do that is most people will agree with you. We're not in 1920 anymore. It's not 1880 anymore. This is a culture that's largely cosmopolitan, in which liberalism has seeped quite deeply, in which publicly committed racists are a quite small minority now. So I'm actually quite hopeful. I think if and when we come back to a universalistic discourse, one in which workers are seen as the chief agent, now we not only have a chance for a genuinely social democratic advance, but for the first time in 3 generations, we'll have a chance for an anti-racist advance as well.
Most people, dare I say, all people, any sentient person would be on board, of course, with anti-racism in terms of no racism. I think a lot of people with the raising of, well, let's say Trump was elected a year ago, he walked into office and he had this mandate by people who were sick of EDI, sick of certain identity politics being, as they would say, shoved down our throats. And to a large degree, I'm empathetic with what they're going through because on the right, and we saw this during lockdown, I was floored by how many alleged leftist publications were not touching lockdown, not critiquing lockdown. I heard from editors, we can't run this piece. It'll make it look like we're anti-lockdown or we're anti-mask. And who was raising these issues but Tucker Carlson? Now, I imagine you remember Tucker Carlson back in 2003.
I do, yeah.
And I tell you, talk about a transformation of a person. And he's apologized profusely for his take and even propulsion of a certain discourse around the global war on terror. And here we are now. I feel like we're in a world where the left and right have completely collapsed in terms of valences that we can distinctly discuss. For instance, you just mentioned a lot of the movements in India. Anyone who's been in India when the price of garlic goes up, fascinating. I wish we had riots like that in the West, because the organization of Indians, of Bengalis, of Pakistanis is on another astro level than it is in, let's say, North America. We don't have that level of organization. And for, I'd say, good reason. The level of poverty is quite different. The price of garlic is central to...
Yeah, I think actually, Gillian, I think it was onions you're talking about. It was when the price of onions went up.
That's it. I'm sorry. You're absolutely right. It was onions. I don't know why I went for garlic. Well, it might be worse.
I mean, they're both pretty basic. Yeah.
It might be worse. You're right. It was onions. And I was in Karnataka at the time. I was just floored. I guess going back to Tucker Carlson in lockdown, my publisher at a very leftist publication saying, we can't run this piece because it will make us look anti-lockdown. And I thought, oh my God, have I entered into the Twitter sphere of publishing? Like, is this where we are? Their editors are afraid of being no platformed. Same editor. I tell you, I wrote a piece for them. It was the investigative piece on the gender wars in the UK. And wow, we ended up being threatened with death and rape on their recording device. 100 threats, I was told, were left for them and his daughter, me and my 6-month-old daughter as well. I had to leave the UK over these threats. And when I was thinking of identity politics, ironically, I wasn't thinking about racial justice at all. Because in a way, Vivek, I take it as a truism that in society today, we've reached to a certain level. Well, I think most people understand that the pointy white hats are not cool anymore. That discourses of, but they play basketball well, or this kind of stuff is out the door. And I think we're at the level of maybe, I'm thinking of Anthony Appia's In My Father's House, where he speaks of racialism. We might still have that to tease out over many, many years, and maybe we're going to regress. Who knows? I think now my readings over social theory and economic theory lead me to believe that this idea that progress is teleological, well, no. I think we do this kind of cha-cha-cha. I begin to wonder if maybe part of the problem is the way that identity politics, when I'm thinking of it, I'm thinking of, let's say, the way in which you mentioned women, but women have been shunned by the left, if you ask them. The women who left Labour, right? Jeremy Corbyn had serious problems with those feminists because they said, we don't want men in our prisons. We don't want men in our hospital wards. You're telling me that women can have penises is just intellectually offensive, right? And this debate was going on when I started writing the pieces for this publication on the left. And I was taken aback by the way within that first piece I wrote and then the second piece I wrote, I was immediately called a TERF, okay? Now, I'm not a radical feminist, but I saw more and more women being given this moniker, and I wondered, why have Marxists not been able to address something? It's the elephant in the room. Historical materialism is visible. You can touch what are workers' rights. You can see wage increase, decrease. A lot of what is going on here is a kind of commodity fetishism, but not of the working class production. This is a kind of commodity fetishism of ideology. And I looked at it as I call it the clown sidecar. You know, when you're at the circus and they're taking down the nets and they don't want you to look at that. So they have the clowns come out. And I'm like, why are we being given this sidecar show of identity that call yourself whatever you want, do what you want, I don't care. But what has happened, and I'm sure you've seen this over the last decade or so, the prescriptive language. You must call me. You must use these pronouns. You must. And this is where the feminists said, bye, Corbyn. And a lot of his dispossession amongst Labour had to do with that. And I'm thinking about this because we are now in this kind of Wild West era. We've got Trump back in. He's done something that has blown my mind because, you know, in the run-up to his election, I told people, well, I actually think he might be the safer choice in terms of international wars because we've done nothing other than create one war after another in my lifetime. And at least in his first term, he did something I've never lived through, which was a term without no new wars. He kept a few things going. He tried to get out of Syria, had that general no platform him. I don't know if you followed that bit. It was insane. And now we've got Trump, who's looking more like Ronald Reagan in a certain sense with Central and South America. I'm very concerned, Vivek, that now we've got the GOP that's divided. That's fascinating. He has a mandate of peacenik Republicans that don't want any more to do with any of this. In fact, the rhetoric is very similar to what a lot of people on the left would say. No more money for these wars. Let's take care of America. America fits into their sentences all the time, but they want focus on infrastructure, roads, healthcare, jobs, just like people on the left. And then you've got this revitalization with the kidnapping of Maduro on this kind of Reagan-esque dream of control over there. So the Donroe Doctrine is going through. This is insanity, of course. We've kidnapped a standing political figure. Here we are with the left arguing over pronouns, right? And that's what kills me. It's like I get a little angry as someone who's very much on the left and very impassioned by this, because when I mentioned that historically groups have come together to fight for their rights, I was thinking of 80s, gay men dying of AIDS. I was part of ACT UP in New York City. Yes, fight, but that needed to happen. Whether or not we can call that leftism, it was certainly necessarianism. And I'd say most people fighting that fight were definitely on the left. Why is it now the case that we have a growing working class made of people who are highly educated, unable to have jobs, who in many cases might even have fewer rights than the factory worker, right? Because a lot of people coming out of universities are now in this kind of bizarre gig economy themselves as freelancers or whatnot. How can we understand how the left could move forward when, on the one hand, we've got these circuses going on over very individualizing narratives that have nothing to do with the commune, and on the other, we've got these destructions happening all over the place, such as Venezuela. His sights are on Greenland. I mean, this is insane. And we have seemingly no power because the squad, where are the squad?
Yeah. My view is that we're essentially starting over. I think what's called the left has no connection to what that grouping stood for historically. And the language, the rhetoric, the commitments of the left have nothing to do with the traditional language and commitments and orientations of the left. So, when the Sanders moment started in 2016, a lot of people, myself included, thought, okay, this is our moment to revitalize the left and maybe for the first time in 40 years start moving things forward. But I think what we found was when we started coming out and trying to make arguments for and organizing for the revitalization of labor movements, what we found was the first attacks came from what is called the left. All the attacks came from the left. And it was along these identitarian, tiny little narrow sectional grounds that you pointed out. And the question was, what's going on? How did this happen? And what one quickly realized was that over the course of the past 35, 40 years in the neoliberal era, as all institutions of ordinary people were dismantled, not just trade unions, but civic groups, neighborhood organizations, just places like bowling alleys, as Robert Putnam famously said, bowling is also now gone. There's no place for people to come together. There's no sense of a collective endeavor. In that era, what happened was that the groups that were best positioned to try to get something for themselves did so. And those were all groups towards the top. It was all upper middle class and bourgeois groups. And in order to justify their narrow demands, their desire to seek more positions for themselves in halls of power, they used the language of gender, race, identity, etc. And once it became clear that this is the way to get something for yourself in an era when you can't do collective struggles, well, the way to success was to monetize whatever little identity you had. You started with gender and race, but then, of course, you parsed out the universe into smaller and smaller and smaller slices, each slice saying, we are the most oppressed. Everybody has to now look to us, prove yourselves to us. And, unfortunately, the trans movement was the final chapter in that. And my reading of this, Julian, is that what happened with the trans movement was they're the tiniest, smallest movement for social justice that we've seen in the modern era. And they naturally would have sought some kind of universalistic discourse and some kind of lateral connections with other movements if conditions were different. But what happened was that after 2014, 2015, the Democrats essentially gave them a lot of power. And whenever you get a minoritarian movement getting the backing of the state, it absolves that movement of the responsibility and the necessity of seeking alliances because it's got power. It's power coming from on top. And I really do think that's where a lot of the authoritarianism came in, and the name calling and the slurs and the immediate calumniation. And what's happened, it's backfired. The movement has taken a huge step backwards because of it, because nobody wants to be called a TERF just for saying, hey, I think, sex might be real. I think biology might be real. Now suddenly you're a fascist for saying so. It backfired tremendously, and it's not coming back. I don't think it'll ever come back now because you're 1% of the population at best. And now you've cornered yourself to the point where nobody wants to hear it anymore. Frankly, that's what's happened with race as well. Because of the elite takeover of race politics and the absolutely brazen and shameless way in which they not only sought power for themselves, but calumniated and race baited everyone who dared to question a narrow class-based demand for corporate representation, for affirmative action at Yale and Harvard and things like that. The race movement has taken a huge step back. So my view is, even though they have lost, these guys you're not going to get black bourgeois and Latino bourgeois turning to the masses. It's just never going to happen. So they're not going to change. And they're going to continue to use the language of the left because they can't say, I'm shameless. I just want all the power for myself. I want all the goodies for myself. Just give them to me. They're going to continue to use the oppression card and the marginalization card, which means there's going to be something like a left that is narrow, authoritarian, horrible in many ways. And the socialist, the working class left, can't rely on them, even though rhetorically they seem to be aligned. And so, therefore, we're starting over. We're going to have to just go back to the very basics and say what it seems like insanely stupid and simple, which is we're all human beings. We all have needs. Capital is systematically destroying all of us. They're pitting us against each other along these different lines. And until we come together in a humane, liberal, universalistic discourse, what's going to happen is what we've seen over the past 15 years, which is the rise of Trump. That's what it's going to be.
Well, that's what it has resulted in. I wanted to shift, though, to something you mentioned earlier when you were discussing the Indian bourgeoisie. You've described yourself as a proud defender of the radical Enlightenment tradition. How do you respond to critics who claim that these universal categories are inherently Eurocentric and cannot fully capture the specificities of non-Western histories? On the other hand, you argue that post-colonial theorists like Ranajit Guha and Dipesh Chakrabarti overstate the difference between East and West. If the Indian bourgeoisie was indeed non-hegemonic, how can we explain the specific persistence of pre-capitalist social forms like caste without falling back on the culturalist arguments that you reject?
Two things. One is that it's absolute nonsense. It doesn't have a single leg to stand on. This idea that Enlightenment categories are inherently Eurocentric and that they necessarily obscure the realities of the East. In my mind, this whole discourse died twice. It first died during the Arab Spring in 2011. What happened during the Arab Spring when you had the indigenous Arab masses rise up? What were they calling for? They were calling for jobs, bread, equal rights, and humanity. This was not something that communist parties or Western NGOs engineered. It was movements organized by Egyptians, by Tunisians, by Syrians, by the Lebanese, and they were all asking for exactly those things that post-colonial theorists say are Western obsessions. Now, that was the first death. The second death is the genocide against the Palestinians. And I was amused to see all these Arab Palestinian post-colonialists who have been calumniating the Enlightenment for 30 years come out and say, what? The Palestinians are being denied their humanity. And I wanted to say, well, what humanity, man? You've been saying that the notion of a common humanity is a European conception. And now, when it comes to brass tacks, you rely on Enlightenment categories and the language of rights and the denial of rights to paint the injustice. So the fact is, Julian, it's dead. The problem is it's a zombie. The thing about zombies is they're dead, but they keep walking around. The reason they're walking around is there is oceans of money that flows into these post-colonial studies departments, and every single NGO uses this language. And as long as there's money behind it, they're going to keep doing it. Now, intellectually, analytically, it's dead. Okay, that's a sociological fact. Now, what about analytically? You said, why do things like caste continue to exist? when India is becoming capitalist and the Indian bourgeoisie has sought power. Well, caste, what is caste? Caste is a series, a dense set of networks in which people organize their social activities, like marriage circles, like charity, and things like jobs and finding sustenance for themselves in cities, like through things like housing. What caste comes down to in any Indian's life, fundamentally, what caste is not a symbolic thing. It's not a discursively organized system of hierarchy. It is a social relation through which goods, services, and labor are distributed. Now, why didn't it disappear when capitalism came about? Because in an economy of scarcity, like you have in India, where you have people coming to the cities looking for jobs, and there's no welfare state, there's tremendous insecurity, there's all kinds of mad scramble for resources, they have to seek sustenance through their social connections. And the social connections that they rely on happen to be always linguistic, regional, and caste. So there's a lot of literature on this that economists and sociologists have carried out. And what it's shown is that caste is sustained not through a primordial religious, cultural fidelity to all these ancient mores. It's sustained for brute economic reasons in people's lives, which is they need their social networks to be able to survive. And the same is true in the rural areas as well. So it has a material existence, it has a material sustenance. And capitalism does have elements inside it that seek to dissolve caste because people are randomly distributed into labor markets to look for jobs, regardless of their caste background. But the very insecurity and depredations of the labor market also incline people, including the lowest castes, to seek out and to sustain their caste connections. So it's no mystery. It is an entirely materialist explanation for this. And finally, I'll say this. People like Chatterjee, Chakrabarti, when they say, these are Western theories, we can't use them. Okay, Dibesh Chakrabarti, who's your theorist? Oh, it turns out it's a guy named Martin Heidegger. It's a guy named Michel Foucault. So the entire thing is fraudulent. Top to bottom, the whole thing is fraudulent. And it's a symptom of the profound intellectual and cultural degeneration that took place in neoliberalism, part of which was it threw up a stratum of black and brown intellectuals who were mind-bogglingly corrupt. And this is the people who we're talking about.
Well, it's interesting as you spoke. I was thinking to a lot of the arguments that Indians will tell me. I was very unaware about the quota system in the public sector, for instance. And then, of course, we saw similar actually outrages in Bangladesh, but not based on caste, but based on who fought for independence, right?
Yeah.
But it's similar in a sense that you've got the scheduled castes, the scheduled tribes, other backward classes, for people who do not understand. That's the terminology, not my saying that.
Yeah.
Economically weaker sections as well. And these comprise of various percentages. And what happens is Indians coming from the middle class will often express anger about these kinds of hiring quotas. And it reminded me, my 10-year-old South, who had just moved from Canada to the Deep South, and then Mississippi after that, I heard this being couched in different ways and in racist ways by white, let's say, Mississippians, angry because of what they had perceived as quotas, real or not, because a lot of what they call quotas were just fictional. But anyways,
Yeah.
what I'm seeing is, in terms of what we mentioned before, in terms of DEI and identity politics, have we on the left thrown the dice in a way naively thinking these laws will help? I'm thinking of John F. Kennedy's work on this subject, and then what has happened in India as well. Is this the idea that making laws will just fix it all and over time it'll somehow adapt? What do you see as maybe some of the faults that on the left we thought legislation would take care of these issues, when in fact it might have to a certain degree, sure, offered opportunities, sure, but to whom, in what postal code, right? And we haven't even talked about the Jack and Jill Club. So we're talking about a kind of mélange of goodwill, social economic reforms, or legislation policies on the one hand, but they didn't count on people might get bitter if this keeps going forward, right?
Yeah.
Has this been in the long run a bad idea?
I think what's happened is that there's been a change in the way we view these things, or the left view them. I think when these programs were first promulgated, the idea was that they would be part of a broader expansion of opportunities for women and for minorities over lower caste people in whichever country they were started in. And they would be they were instituted to try to guard against discrimination, and that's why they were called positive discrimination. It wasn't that you're supposed to have a certain fixed quota that you fulfill of certain groups of people. It was that when you have two people who are equally qualified, you should opt for the woman over the lower caste person or for the religious minority, etc. So A, it wasn't a quota, and B, it was meant to be part of a larger expansion of opportunities. But with the defeat of the left, and the decline of labor, and the decline of peasant organizations in the global south, these affirmative action programs essentially became all there was in terms of opportunities. And they hardened. Like in India, it went from affirmative action to actual quotas in the 1990s. Now, that in any condition would have elicited a negative reaction from people. But in a situation where you have enormous underemployment, and India is unusual, the highest level of underemployment right now is amongst college-educated people. And that's the sector in which you have the greatest number of quota requirements and affirmative action. So they really feel the crunch. In the United States, affirmative action has overwhelmingly benefited the black and brown middle class and the elites. Now, what happens is not only did the masses get left out, but these elites found that they had a vested interest in defending these quotas. And secondly, they have their own class instincts, and their class instincts are a contempt and a rejection of universalistic programs, and especially of things like trade unions and redistribution. I mean, Bear Dresden once brilliantly said, 1969, why do you expect black middle class to be different from the white middle class? They're going to be as hostile to black workers as the white middle class is to white workers. And that means they'll be equally hostile to programs that are meant to benefit black workers. And this is what we've seen over the past 20 years, which is, it's just astonishingly, even I was surprised by this. When after 2016, the call for trade unions and universalistic programs and redistribution came from the left, and we pointed out that minorities benefit from this more than anyone else. The Democratic Party had a very deep cadre of black politicals and intellectuals who came out arguing against redistribution. Now, so you have a situation in which affirmative action is not only helping a very small group of people, but those same people are arguing against measures that will help the vast majority of their own race and their own gender. So there's a backlash because it's so obviously now seen as a very tiny little sectional group that's only advancing itself. And then on top of that, it uses this language of DEI, where everyone's a racist, everyone's a TERF, everyone's a misogynist. So now you can imagine why the backlash is so severe. Now, so the question is, was it a mistake? Well, I think if we'd known back then, if people on the Martin Luther King and everybody else had known back then what it would turn into, they would have been, I think, less. They were already hesitant. King was very hesitant in supporting affirmative action because he said it's going to turn the white majority against us. And he was right. I would say now that I wouldn't want to dismantle it all just yet because it does do some good. But what absolutely has to be rejected is this idea that this is the linchpin of social justice. Because on the left, now this is the hallmark. If you criticize affirmative action or if you call into question anything, you're now calumniated. You're cast out. But it's being used as a cudgel against universalism. And so we have to say, look, the real answer is what is the Poor People's Program, what King and Rustin were fighting for. It can have an element of affirmative action inside it, but we have to see that that's just a footnote. In and of itself, all it's going to do is create yet more members of a minority elite of women in the corporate boardrooms, but it's not done a thing for people at the bottom.
You're listening to Savage Minds, and we hope you're enjoying the show. Please consider subscribing. We don't accept any money from corporate or commercial sponsors, and we depend upon listeners and readers just like you. Now, back to our show. In a lot of my work over the gender issue, and I've had guests on the show who point out this whole thing was kicked off by feminists, and they're not wrong. I'm speaking about the Oppression Olympics. And the Oppression Olympics is a great machinery of capitalism. People set up NGOs, organizations, feminist groups are set up to hear your complaint. Women first, believe all women. We saw with the rise of Me Too and the Pussy Hat marches, remember, in DC and elsewhere. Yeah. These were being organized not by workers, they were being organized by even our colleagues, professors who were saying we need to be heard. But the way they were posturing this was twinning women's rights with other rights that the women themselves didn't agree with, hence there was infighting. Or the rise of the professional managerial class. And you've got the Robin DiAngelos opining, being paid 6 figures to opine about white guilt. I find this hysterical. It reminds me of Spike Lee's Bamboozled, because you've got this whole function of confession, I mean, very Foucauldian too, of public confession. You go to one of her workshops, you're purified. So the role of the professional class is something you've written about, the professional managerial class. To what extent has what we're talking about, the left, been captured by the interests of these discourses because of this class that makes its bread and butter by talking about racial injustice, sexist injustice, by misogyny, transphobia, etc., etc.? And how has this shifted its focus away from traditional labor organizing?
It's 100%. The capture is complete. That's why we're having to start over, because these words have no meaning anymore. You know, I don't know if you've noticed the kind of the acceleration of the discourse. So in the 80s and 90s, you know, you'd be called a sexist or you'd be called a racist. Misogyny was reserved for really extreme cases. And in the race stuff, white supremacy was something you used to describe the Klan. Now, you go straight to white supremacy. You go straight to being a misogynist. You go straight to being a transphobe and a trans-fascist. The acceleration of this rhetoric is mind-boggling. You don't get a chance. There's no halfway anymore. You go from being an ordinary person to a fascist if you don't agree with every single point. Why is that? I think it's pretty clear. These people aren't interested in making alliances. You know, if you're constantly baiting everyone, you know you're turning everyone off. So why are you doing it if you want to, quote, fight for racial justice or social justice? It's because you're fighting. What you call fighting is actually just patronage. You're relying on power, on support from above. And you know you don't have to win anyone over. That's true for these feminist groups. It's true for the anti-racist groups as well. So that reflects the fact, 2 things. One is the class composition of the people who are engaging in this stuff, the social networks, the world in which they circulate. And secondly, where they seek their leverage. And in all these groups, it's the Democratic Party. It's the corporate sector. If you're in a different country, it's their political parties. So the language of social justice now has been monetized and captured by these folks. And it's meaningless. It just has no meaning anymore. And it's a horrible fact because they have trivialized really important things. So we're inured now. People get called racist and they shrug it off. People get called sexist and they shrug it off. Why? Because everything is now racism. Everything is sexism. It was trivialized because it was turned into a currency and a means of shutting down debate and getting goodies for yourself. So my view is it's a 100% capture, and we are now in the slow, laborious process of, ironically, rebuilding movements for gender equality, movements for racial equality, while telling the people who are on the other side of the fence, you're not all evil. What we're against is your practices, not your persons. So yeah, it's not going to be the case that if we have a movement, meeting against racism, only no white people are allowed. It can't be the case that if you have a meeting around departmental or workplace problems with sexism, only the women are allowed to talk. You do that, you just turn the men against you. You do that, you just turn all the whites against you. So if you're going to rediscover the left, you're going to have to start with universalism. You're going to have to start with interests and whose interests are actually involved in this. And you're going to have to make distinctions within these so-called groups and not just across them, and realize that elites everywhere are basically the same, whether they're women, black, or brown.
Yeah, I've been thinking a lot about this collapse of left and right around the issue of immigration, especially in Europe, where I had people on the left approaching me and saying, I'm actually part of my labor union. I'm very far to the left, but an Italian, but our borders, we don't have enough jobs for all these people, they would say to me. You have argued that capitalists use immigration to divide the working class, something I completely agree with. I also think, conversely, that the Democrats lie and speak out of both sides of their mouths on this issue, by the way, because they claim to be pro-immigration, but in reality, we didn't see a lot of good acts coming out of the Biden or Obama administrations on this issue either. How can the left support migration rights without allowing capital to use it as a tool to bypass local labor standards, to suppress wages, and beyond?
I think it's a very good point. This is one of the defining issues at the moment, and it's been a learning experience for all of us, I think, and learning the hard way. That I think everybody on the left is instinctively sort of in favor of laxity and more openness on borders because we want people to have the right to move around, and especially in a country like the U.S., you understand. A lot of the immigrants trying to come into the U.S. are economic refugees, not political refugees. And a big reason why they're economic refugees has to do with the way in which the U.S. uses its power over those countries. Mexico is a very good example. The destruction of Mexican agriculture after NAFTA through the flooding of their countryside with American agribusiness products. Now, that's something the U.S. did, and it drove a lot of peasants off the land, and understandably, they seek refuge in the United States. So we understand this. But it is also the case that American workers have real concerns of their own. Now, some of those concerns are manufactured. They're told that this labor flooding into the country is going to take your jobs away. And the data on that is very mixed. I mean, it's marginal at best. But the concerns are real. And you're not going to win them over by wagging your finger at them. You're not going to
or calling
win
them
over
racists.
Exactly, by calling them racists or things like this. So what you have to do, and it is a fact that under Biden, there was an enormous flooding of entrance over the borders, and it was completely unregulated, uncontrolled, and chaotic. And states in the Southwest had to deal with this. Now, that's all true. And you're not going to get anywhere by ignoring it. So I think one lesson we've learned is that we have our principles, but there's also the harsh reality of where the world is today. And if you want to ultimately enact those principles, you have to start by dealing with the world as it is and figuring out a strategy to get from here to there into that world that you'd like to be in. And the world as it is today says you have to limit the flow of refugees to the point where you can manage their incorporation into the political economy in a way that's stable and that's sustainable. Now, what does that mean to manage it? You have to bring them in and you have to give them jobs as soon as possible. And more importantly, you have to give them rights as soon as possible. One way in which employers are able to use immigration is this. It's a very long and arduous process for immigrants to get political rights and therefore legal protections as workers. And if they can't get legal protections as workers, of course, employers are going to take advantage of that. And how do they take advantage of it? They're giving them really shitty working conditions, low wages, and make them live the lives of the extremely deprived, which obviously puts pressure, downward pressure on all the conditions of work that the workers, American workers are facing over here, and then they will see it as a threat. What you need to do is to give them, the law should say, if you're bringing in immigrant workers, they have to be given the same wages as local workers, whether they're Indian engineers who do not get the same conditions, or whether they're Guatemalan and Mexican workers who do not get the same conditions. And you have to bring them in such a way that they start contributing to social welfare as soon as possible, so they're not seen simply as people who are draining the exchequer and draining the public budget. You have to do all this. Now, I think that is entirely consistent with progressive principles. What you're saying is capitalism is what it is. All of these people are workers. We bring them in a way that the labor market can absorb them, and we give them the rights that every worker should have. That's manageable and it's different from open borders, but it's also different from the kind of draconian policies we're seeing right now from the right.
Yes. Plus, one thing the left is, I'd say, just as guilty as the right is on this immigration is the cause of the immigration. Now, here in Europe, our immigration is coming often because of wars that our country has started. Syria, on and on, the global
Absolutely.
war on terror still. In the US, if you're thinking of Mexico, Central America, and further south, this is another MO, let's say. There's something else that's going on. Of course, American economic policies, our push and pull on the World Bank, IMF, have affected enormous damage to every single country south of the border. I don't think Argentina's current leader is in office because of anything other than these policies, to be quite honest. People
Sure.
vote with their wallet. We know this. It's not about, oh, you're a fascist. Oh, you're just like Hitler. These are things sadly coming out of the mouths of people who call themselves leftists. It sort of dumbs down the point. And you are getting to this kind of sinuous material that talks about some of the effects and causes. You have suggested that we might be seeing the end of the neoliberal era. But, we have on the one hand, Venezuela, we have immigration concerns. Even now, you're seeing Democrats starting to talk about this. The day after the election was the first time I saw Democrats talk
Yeah.
about it.
Yeah.
And
Right.
and then, of course, no one's talking about the fact that Marx talked about this, but he talked about it in terms of driving down wages as well, right? And
Yeah.
and that
Yeah. You did.
immigrants were used as a cudgel against the working class of the nation. Aside from your disillusion from Bernie, do you have any hope? I mean, I'm very skeptical about Mamdani. Not anything personal about him, but I've just been there, done that, if you know what I mean.
No, I'm I'm actually quite optimistic.
Yeah, yeah.
um, and it's because I lived through the '90s and the 2000s, and they discourse on the left degenerated so rapidly in the '90s and afterwards, and the hegemony that identitarian views attained on the left was so complete. The mere fact that you have a podcast like yours, and there are many others right now, where I actually see for the first time in my lifetime a genuine debate on the left. There was no debate for 30 years. There was no debate over the primacy of class or the centrality of class. It was understood that at best, in the early 2000s, it was called multiple oppressions theory. Now it's called intersectionalism. It was just that, yeah, class is in there somewhere. It's one of many things, but there's nothing special about it. Now you're actually getting mass organs of the left, podcasts, YouTube channels, magazines. Jacobin is another one, where it's now defended that being on the left is about organizing workers, prioritizing the interests of workers. I think that's a big deal. Secondly, I'll say this. Just in the past 3 years, Gillian, um, after the murder of George Floyd, liberals kind of lost their minds. And it became an orgy of identitarianism. And that's when all this stuff around turf and Eurofascist and all this really attained its peak. That's what I call woke. And what you've seen that just in the last, I would say, 8 to 10 months is a dramatic reversal. You said it yourself. The second election, Trump's victory was a very big deal. It was a wake-up call for the people around the Democratic Party. And, most of the left is still around the Democratic Party. It was a wake-up call that this is the absolute death of everything we cherish unless we get our act together. And the left has driven people into Trump's arms. It's actively driven people into Trump's arms. Secondly, I do believe if you look at the campaigns that Mamdani waged, now there's this new mayor of Seattle. She just came to power a month ago. They're explicitly and consciously avoiding, even eschewing the identitarian stuff that you and I are talking about. Their campaigns are all about economic needs, affordability, bringing people together, of actually focusing on common interests that bind together white and black and brown workers and women. They're small steps, but they're they're gigantic leaps in what I think is a learning process for this emerging new left, where it's having to rediscover the ABCs of basic socialist politics. I haven't seen anything like this since 1980, which is when I moved to the United States. In the 90s, the Kshama Sawant got elected into the city council in Seattle, and everyone was ecstatic. And now look what's happening. They were winning mayoral elections in major cities, people calling themselves socialists. Will they achieve much? I don't know. But I'd much rather be in a universe where we're fighting and losing than in a universe in which we're not able to fight at all, and all our energies has to be directed against people who call themselves leftists. Now I can direct my energies at the actual enemies, which is capital and its representatives.
Wow. Okay. No, I love this. My mind is, first of all, when you said you moved to the States in the 80s, because when we first started speaking, I've read your work. I have not heard your voice. I'm like, oh, he doesn't have a Desi accent. Sometimes it makes me, I get homesick. So that feeds my homesickness. And so Hindi bolte hai.
Okay. नहीं हिंदी में बोलता हूँ लेकिन बहुत पहले से यहाँ आया पड़ा इसलिए.
Acha. No, I tell you, like, this is, we're living in this very profound moment. I don't know if you've been keeping up back home with the television shows, but now or not now, I mean, I guess it was a decade ago, but there was this television show about a working space. Gosh, I don't even know if it was in Mumbai or Delhi. And basically it was about foreigners working in the office. Have you seen this? I forgot the name of it.
No, I haven't
and
seen
it's very interesting. It's sort of the future of when Americans need to go to India for work.
Okay.
And they will call themselves Lakshmi and answer the phone. And,
That's hilarious. Okay,
yeah,
that's
it's
funny.
my Monty Python impersonation of the future, but it could be. And
Yeah.
so I was just thinking about this turn, like your delusion with Sanders. I too was hopeful. And then when that happened, I think that's why I worry that the rhetoric is bigger than the reality. So I was thinking, what specific material or structural changes in his campaign allowed him to reinsert class and economics back into the political landscape dominated by this identity.
You're talking about Sanders here?
Yeah, well, I'm speaking about Mamdani, because Mamdani sort of pulled the carpet out of Sanders. I mean, I think a lot of people are properly angry with Sanders. They feel like he consciously made a backdoor deal with Clinton.
Yeah.
Some people have said this, right?
Well, not with Clinton. He made one with Biden. I think that's true. And he's been very open about it. One thing about Sanders is he never lies. So he just said, I thought this was the best we could do at the moment. And I think he made some tactical mistakes in doing that. Now, the thing with Mamdani is he's remarkable in this. If you looked at Zoran Mamdani, say 5 years ago, he embodied the worst of everything in identitarian culture. Everything about him. He was all for defunding the police and on finding the most marginal groups to care for. He'd show up at every event, and it was all about the most marginal this, the most marginal that. And suddenly, starting about a year and a half ago, you see changes in him, and I think it's real. And I think he's just an unusual person, which is that he saw the absolute shellacking that Kamala Harris received. And his response was to go into Queens and the Bronx and interview people of color, everyday people on the streets. And he made a video out of it, which you can see now.
Oh, yes,
and
I saw it.
What they said to him was, I voted for Trump. I voted for Trump. I voted for Trump. And okay, this punctures the white identitarian woke image of people of color because they're all pure, they're all perfect, and they only vote for revolutionary communists.
And
here you have of course. And he says, why? And they said, look, man, Biden did nothing for me. And furthermore, they said Biden allowed the genocide to start. He said there are these two things, right? And what does Mamdani do? He takes it in. And if you look at his campaign, there were two things that endeared him to people. One, he didn't back down on Palestine, but he didn't turn it into an accusation that everybody who is on the other side is a fascist. He said, this is what I stand for. This is what I believe, and I will fight for it. And I hope you all come to see that it's unjust and wrong. So secondly, he says, it's all about the economics. It's about the basics in life, housing, jobs, etc. And you saw, not only did he get the working class vote, He got the black working class vote, which tends to be, and this is, people don't talk about this, but it tends to be the most conservative of all the voting blocks in the Democratic Party. And then he got the Jewish vote. Now, that's partly because it's New York, and there are a lot of progressive Jews in New York, but it's also because he did not calumniate, attack, and anger. He just couched his beliefs in the language of humanity, of decency, and it was very hard to attack him. They tried their best to call him a jihadist and this and that, but he just did a marvelous job fending all this stuff off. And this has had a electric effect on the rest of the left, where even a year and a half ago, if you made the argument, as I've been making, you must prioritize people's economic interests, you were raked over the coals by the left. And now what's happened is everyone is quietly shut up about this. Everyone now is saying, oh yeah, we were all, if you just look at the Twitter sphere, all the identitarians are saying, not all, it's an exaggeration, but so many of them, yeah, we were always about the economic. We always said this, but we just said, don't forget about race. And I was, you never said, don't forget about race.
Exactly.
What you were saying was, if you're lucky, we won't forget about class. That's what you were saying. So it really has created a atmosphere, a setting where socialists and labor-oriented people can finally start moving forward. Now, that's a discursive cultural shift. How much will he actually achieve? That's a question of class balance, man. And I'd be surprised if he achieves very much. I mean, look at us, we're flat on our backs. But we've got to start somewhere. We have to start somewhere. And I don't know how it could be any different than it is now. In 2022-23, after the George Floyd murder, when DEI was at its peak, when woke was at its peak, I actually was starting to despair. And I was starting to think, fuck it. Who needs this? I make good money. I'm just going to go retreat, teach my classes. Who needs to be on the left? These people are insane. They'll never be worth anything.
Yeah. I hear you.
I don't feel that way anymore. I mean, I'm still frustrated, but I see real hope. I see normal, ordinary people coming to the left who are not emotional cripples, who are not filled with hate and bile, who don't try to turn everything into themselves, who are not just narcissists. And that says, okay, fine, this gives us something to work with. Let's see what we can do with it.